In a quaint, isolated town nestled deep within the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, there stood a weathered old house. This house had long been abandoned, left to decay amidst whispers of tragic events that had unfolded within its walls. Legends spoke of a man who had once resided there, a recluse shrouded in mystery and darkness. His name was forgotten, lost to time, but his presence lingered in the eerie atmosphere that surrounded the house. One stormy night, as the rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, a young man named Alex found himself seeking shelter from the tempest. Lost and disoriented, he stumbled upon the old house, its silhouette looming ominously against the backdrop of the storm. Desperate for refuge, Alex pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the darkness within. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the only sound was the steady drip of water leaking from the ceiling. As Alex explored the abandoned rooms, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and strange noises echoed through the empty halls. But he brushed off his unease, chalking it up to his imagination running wild in the eerie surroundings. Night fell, and Alex settled down in a dusty old armchair by the fireplace, hoping to wait out the storm until morning. But as the hours passed, he found himself unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him like a shroud. Suddenly, a chilling whisper filled the room, sending shivers down Alex's spine. He glanced around frantically, but he was alone here, so he thought. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate, drawing closer with each passing moment. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he watched in horror as the figure of a man emerged from the shadows. It was the recluse, the long-forgotten inhabitant of the house. His features obscured by the darkness that enveloped him, he moved with an unnatural grace, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light as he fixed his gaze on Alex. With a sudden burst of terror, Alex turned to flee, but the doors and windows were sealed shut, trapping him within the house's suffocating embrace. Panic clawed at his throat as he realized he was not alone in the darkness. There were others, phantoms of the past, condemned to wander the halls for eternity. As the night stretched on, Alex was plunged into a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Shadows whispered secrets of unspeakable horrors, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. In the cold light of dawn, rescuers finally arrived, drawn by reports of a lost hiker seeking shelter from the storm. But when they entered the old house, they found no trace of Alex, only the lingering echoes of his screams, swallowed by the darkness that had claimed him. To this day, the old house remains standing, a silent sentinel guarding its dark secrets, and those who dare to venture too close can still hear the echoes of solitude, whispering of the horrors that lie within its walls. In the heart of a dense forest, nestled far from civilization, stood a forgotten cabin. This cabin, with its cracked windows and weathered walls, exuded an eerie aura that kept even the bravest souls at bay. Stories whispered through the trees, tales of the cabin's tragic past, warning all who dared to venture near. Years ago, a family of four sought solace in the cabin, seeking refuge from the chaos of the world. But what began as a peaceful retreat soon turned into a nightmare. One fateful night, as a blizzard howled outside, a series of unexplainable events unfolded within the cabin's walls. The parents, John and Sarah, were all walking by, strange noises echoing through the corridors. At first, they dismissed them as the creaks of an old house settling under the weight of the snow. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder, more ominous. Their children, Emily and Michael, slept soundly in their beds, unaware of the lurking danger. John ventured into the darkness, his breath forming misty clouds in the frigid air. Each step he took seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive with malevolent intent. Sarah stayed behind, her heart pounding with fear. She clutched a rusty fireplace poker, the only weapon she could find, as she listened to the sounds of her husband's footsteps fade into the distance. Minutes stretched into hours, and still, John did not return. Desperation clawed at Sarah's chest as she called out into the darkness, her voice swallowed by the relentless storm. But there was no response, only the haunting silence of the forest. With trembling hands, Sarah resolved to find her husband, to unravel the mystery that gripped their isolated sanctuary. She ventured into the labyrinthine corridors of the cabin, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that coated the floor. As she searched, Sarah's mind played tricks on her, conjuring shadows in every corner, whispering secrets long forgotten. But she pressed on, driven by a mother's love and a wife's devotion. Finally, Sarah reached the heart of the cabin, a room shrouded in darkness, where, illuminated by the flickering light of a dying candle, she found her husband, his lifeless eyes staring into the abyss. Terror seized Sarah's heart as she realized they were not alone in the cabin. Something ancient, something sinister, lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting. With every ounce of strength left in her, Sarah fled into the night, leaving behind the cursed cabin and its haunted memories. To this day, the cabin stands as a silent sentinel in the heart of the forest, its secrets buried beneath layers of snow and time. But those who dared to venture near can still hear the echoes of solitude, whispers of a family torn apart by forces beyond their comprehension. And in the darkness, something stirs, waiting for its next victim to succumb to the horrors that lie within.
In the heart of a dense forest, shrouded in darkness, stood an old Victorian mansion. Its time-worn facade loomed ominously against the backdrop of whispering trees. Within its walls dwelled Eleanor, a young woman burdened by the weight of loneliness. Eleanor had inherited the mansion from her late parents, who had left her alone in the world. With no siblings or close relatives, the mansion became both her refuge and her prison. As night descended, Eleanor would often find herself engulfed in an eerie solitude that seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the ancient house. One chilly October evening, as the winds howled outside, Eleanor sat by the fireplace, seeking solace in its flickering flames. The only company she had were the shadows dancing on the walls and the distant echoes of her own footsteps. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the empty halls, jolting Eleanor from her trance. Heart pounding, she approached the front door cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. But when she swung the door open, there was no one there, only the darkness of the night staring back at her like a sinister void. Shaken but determined to dismiss it as a figment of her imagination, Eleanor retreated back inside, locking the door behind her. She convinced herself it was just the wind playing tricks on her, a product of her own frayed nerves. Yet the knocks persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. No matter how tightly she shut her ears or how desperately she clung to the dwindling embers of her fire, the sounds clawed at her sanity, refusing to be ignored. As the night wore on, Eleanor's fear transformed into a suffocating dread. Every corner of the mansion seemed to harbor unseen eyes. Every whisper of the wind morphed into sinister murmurs. She was no longer alone. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. With trembling hands, she dialed the emergency services, her voice barely above a whisper as she pleaded for help. But the line remained silent, engulfed by an eerie static that seemed to mock her desperation. In a final act of defiance against the encroaching darkness, Eleanor armed herself with a flashlight and ventured into the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion. Each step echoed like a funeral dirge, leading her deeper into the heart of her own personal purgatory. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, chilling her to the bone. It was a voice she recognized all too well, the voice of her mother, long gone but haunting her still. Tears streaming down her face, Eleanor followed the ghostly whispers, her flashlight casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. Finally, she reached the source of the voice, a hidden chamber concealed behind a tapestry, its walls adorned with faded portraits of her ancestors. In the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. As Eleanor approached the mirror, her reflection began to distort, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. With a blood-curdling scream, she shattered the mirror, shattering the illusion of her solitude. But as the shards fell to the ground, Eleanor realized the true horror of her situation. She was not alone in the mansion. She never had been. She was merely a pawn in a sinister game played by forces beyond her comprehension. And as the darkness consumed her, swallowing her whole, Eleanor knew that she would never escape the echoes of her solitude. For in the heart of the mansion, where shadows danced and whispers lingered, her nightmares would forever reign supreme.